Welcome back to Driva. Today's talk features Chloe Combi, writer and futurist who has interviewed tens of thousands of young people across the globe. Every generation has its rebellion, and the climate crisis is definitely one for Generation Z. Chloe will share their views on where the world is heading and how we can change its path.
Good morning. I'm here today to talk to you about what I'm calling a generations in crisis, which probably sounds a little bit bleak, but all things considered, I think it's worth considering the younger generations in the context of where we are and the crises that we're facing, and more importantly, looking today at some of the solutions that we can come up with to help our younger generations and to work with them. So the next 10 years looks like a better place. So before we begin, when I talk about generations, one of the things I'm often asked about by audiences in general is what generation they belong to. So I'm going to do a very quick breakdown of the generations. So we're going to be focusing on Generation A and Generation Z today, which are the younger generations. So Generation A are the youngest generation. So they're currently in the 2 to 12 age bracket. So they'll be in primary school, going into secondary school. And they're already somewhat tastelessly being called the colonial generations. But the good thing about Generation A is there's already a lot of promise about Generation A, but they are going to be facing lots of challenges. So one of the things I'll be focusing on today is how we make the next 10 years as they go into adulthood and their own teenage years in a sort of a better and a smoother way. The second generation I'll be focusing on today is Generation Z, and obviously I wrote a book about them, and I'll be writing a book about Generation A in the next couple of years. Generation Z fall into the 13 to 24 categories, so they're secondary school students going into the university years. They're often called the first digital generation. Generation Z are doing some amazing things at the moment, but the challenges they face a great deal of uncertainty, both politically, economically, and sociologically. Then we have millennials who are in the 25 to 38 category, so very much in the workplace, even in senior positions. And millennials get a really hard time. They're often called snowflakes or the avocado eating generation. But to be fair to millennials, we invented a lot of the platforms that we all spend so much time on and love. So you should be nice to millennials because to some extent they do rule the world. Then we have Generation X, who fall into the 39 to 52 category, sometimes called the last analog generation because they own things. They own DVDs and records and have taste in films. And they're often called the happiest generation, possibly because they kind of straddle both the old world and the new world. So they understand the internet and kind of what their kids are getting up onto the internet, but they're not completely controlled by the screen. Then we have the baby boomers, which is a really wide and quite controversial cohort. So I do split them into early baby boomers and late baby boomers, obviously because their concerns and interests are quite different. They're quite a maligned generation with obviously the OK boomer tag. Sometimes quite unfairly. I think they're a lot kind of kinder than people give them consideration for, obviously because they have their own children and indeed grandchildren, which they're concerned about. But we do have to be nice to baby boomers, particularly young people, because they're probably our last shot at being able to own a home. Finally, there's silver surfers, often called the silent or the ignored generation. And actually, silver surfers it's rather foolish to sort of overlook them because they have a great deal of kind of power financially, politically. They're often still in positions in powers in kind of government and industry. So a really interesting generation, well worth not ignoring. But for the purposes today, I did want to talk about the younger generations, particularly in context to one of the really big crises we're facing at the moment, which is, of course, the future of our planet and climate and all things green. So Generation A, the ages age 2 to 12, so currently in primary school, going into secondary school, and as I sort of said, somewhat already tastelessly being called the colonial generation. The good thing about Generation A is they're already incredibly switched on. They have this enormous awareness of what's going on in the planet. They're very aware of ecological issues, green issues. They understand things like corporate social responsibility. They have opinions on things like plastic and flying and billionaires and corporations. So they're really impressive, and obviously they're very digitally switched on. But the bad news is if you're an older person, perhaps one of their parents, and you've just got your head around how Instagram and Twitter and even Facebook works, Generation A are going to completely eschew those in favour of obviously TikTok and Quibi, which obviously are the next big things. So that's kind of the really sort of good things about Generation A. I think the real challenges Generation A face are obviously We don't know what's going to happen in the next 10 years, and there's a great deal of uncertainty, and there's real concerns about the planet. So we really have to support them to be able to parlay all their knowledge into really good things and help them a better world. I think another really big challenge that Generation A are going to face, perhaps, so we don't repeat some of the mistakes we made with Generation Z, is this idea of them having a better relationship with screens, perhaps limiting their screen time, because I think this unfettered access to screens was quite detrimental to Generation Z in many ways, which we'll talk about in a moment. So this idea of kind of screen units, limiting Generation A screen times, perhaps so they're mentally healthier. And I think another final big question that's going to surround Generation A is the function of school. One of the things this pandemic has highlighted is really how well the school system is working, whilst we see all these young kids and older kids being sort of home educated. So this idea of with Generation A is whether we have to rethink things like work and education, so it starts to work for these new generations a little bit better from 2020 to 2030. So that's Generation A. Generation Z. So Generation Z are falling into the ages 12 to 24 category. So they're secondary school age, going into university, higher education and the workplace. And initially, when I started looking at Generation Z, so the older Gen Zs, I think they're now called quite humorously Zoomers, a kind of conservatism to Generation Z that I often compared in talks to kind of like the new techie 1950s kids. They were very socially conservative. We were seeing record lows of things like smoking and drinking and recreational drug taking. Pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases were the lowest they've been since the early 60s, so kind of this very conservative generation. And perhaps there was a connection between low pregnancy and STIs and the fact that they're also sober. And they were this kind of socializer generation. That's a portmanteau with stay at home and socializing, because they were the first generation that didn't need to leave their bedrooms to socialize, because they had Instagram and YouTube and Netflix, Google, and all those things that didn't require them actually going out to see their friends. But in the last 3 or 4 years, perhaps as crisis has risen politically, climate-wise, I think that there's been this really interesting sea change with Generation Z. And there's also almost been this kind of like this 1960s resurgence with Generation Z, obviously with the modern sort of technological twist. And we're seeing huge amounts of kind of activism in Generation Z. This very kind of anti-capitalist, this drive towards equality and fairness, which I think are really good things. This use of social media, not just as these kind of platforms where they put up pictures, but in a very entrepreneurial, active way, so that they can create really good change and really positive change. So we're seeing this real shift in Generation Z, perhaps from the self that revolves around social media and the screen and perhaps their own personal brand, to the much more collective and this kind of sense of the world around them and making the world a much better, fairer and more equal place. But I think the big challenge that's going to face Generation Z is this incredible economic anxiety and inequality. And there's already this sort of sense as they've had such limitations as a generation. Should older generations help them? Should there be economic reparation? And how do we find a solution to this incredible economic, political and social anxiety that Generation Z very rightly feel? So that's Generation A and Generation Z in a very kind of truncated nutshell. There's much more to be said about them, of which we'll talk about a bit later on. Now, I've talked a lot to Generation Z and Generation A about what really are their kind of crisis points over the next decade. And there's so many of them, but I kind of wanted to extrapolate a few of the main ones. So I think the big one is this question of how young people get a seat at the table of decision and policy making. So not just this sense of having decisions and policies made for them and about them, but how they can be involved at a political level, at social level, at corporate level. And I think this is really important, because as we make changes, hopefully good changes in the world, young people have to be involved in that decision and policy making. That's incredibly important because it's going to affect them most. The next one is this sense of how do I go green without going broke? And I think this is a big challenge, because I think there is this really big sense that often climate friendly brands are expensive and climate friendly choices are expensive. And you see it with fashion or makeup or trainers or all kinds of things that Generation A and Generation Z like. And I think there has to be that there shouldn't be a choice between being good to the planet and looking good and feeling like you can make brand decisions. So I think it's really important that companies don't make young people decide between socially responsible choices and the brands and companies that they want to buy and work for and they love. Another massive issue, I think, for certainly Generation Z and going for Generation A is the sense that they're hyper connected and hyper aware of what's going on in the world, which is a good thing. But that often comes at the price of them feeling incredibly isolated, incredibly anxious. So how do we balance? How do we help young people balance hyperconnectivity and doing stuff with a sense of well-being? And I think in the next 10 years, there's going to be a huge focus on the well-being of young people, and rightly so. A big question for Gen Z and Gen A over the next decade is where they're going to work and what industries are going to work and what industries are best for the world. And I think a big question, particularly for young people going into the workplace, is looking at the corporate social responsibility of companies and saying, okay, I'm really focused on wanting to choose a company that I work for that has great CSR, but I still want to have lots of job opportunities and be able to work where I like. So again, it's helping that find that balance between opportunity and being socially responsible. In the next 10 years, I think one of the buzzwords, a word that we're all going to be talking about, is this issue of sharing. I think the next 10 years, we actually might almost go into kind of a post-ownership world where we don't want to own cars. We perhaps want to share things like houses, and even things like clothes. And you see this in this kind of sharing economy, whether it's bikes or scooters or even Airbnb. So what is the next 10 years going to look like in this kind of buying, sharing economy? And I think Generation A and Generation Z are really going to drive that. It's very different across Europe, and I think many European countries and global some are much better equipped at facilitating young people. But cities in particular, where universities are and where big companies are and where young people want to live because there's the most opportunity and it's the most vibrant, are very expensive. And what you're seeing is older and older people living with their parents into older in ages. In the UK, only 35% of people under the age of 28 will ever own their own home. And you're seeing this real culture of people in their 20s, 30s, even 40s still living with parents. So how in the next 10 years do we find solutions to young people being able to live independently so that they can flourish? And again, I think part of that, a key to that, might be in this buying and ownership economy. And finally, huge question Gen Z and Gen A have, and I think this is really critical, is they want to make a difference but have no idea where to begin. So again, it's bringing together governments, companies, brands and young people and allowing them to work together to forge a better 10 years as we go from 2020 to 2030. And I think that kind of collaboration is of critical importance. So some of the solutions, these have been the problems. One of the things that young people say is that companies and brands are very influential in the way that they live their lives, perhaps sometimes more influential even than education and government. And I think that puts a real onus of responsibility on major corporations or major brands to provide that education and work with young people to put out a climate-friendly, ecologically progressive message. And I think there's a real onus on everybody to be doing the right thing and working together. And you see it whether it's Google or Netflix or Mac or Nike, they can be incredibly influential in how we behave and our responsibilities. So I think it's this massive buzzword is going to be collaboration. Many of us will be very aware of the principles of something like Tinder, which is where we find strangers for the purposes mostly of romance and meeting new people. And I think that kind of principle actually is a really interesting blueprint for how we actually improve the planet. Because one of the things I've discussed with young people almost is like this sharing Tinder. Like if you have an excess of food, or you want to share your car, or you have a spare room in your house, or you have things that an excess of things, how can you meet up with people so that you can share those things, so that you can save money, so it's better for the climate? And I think the principle of Tinder, reaching out and finding strangers to fuel this sharing economy, this kind of balance between the sharing and ownership economy, will be a really big thing in the next 10 years. And I think it's really worth investing and looking in. Young people absolutely live and die by apps. They use apps for everything, whether it's kind of makeup, weather, or finding things. And I think apps have a really big role to play in how we behave and our relationship with the planet. So, for example, if a company is sort of a green, amber and red traffic light system for companies, so young people know whether brands are good, medium or bad, the sharing thing. Lots of people say that why, if particularly with this Greta Thunberg effect, and we all know increasingly this, for example, travelling and flying is very bad for the planet. And should we have a kind of a finite amount of air or kilometre miles where we share? And again, could an app facilitate this? Reaching out and finding people, so for example, there's communal living facilities, reaching out and finding people who you want to live with and travel with and share things with. So these apps for facilitating a much more communal approach to how we live in the next 10 years. And finally, I think a really big problem and also solution for young people going is the role of education and hiring. And quite simply, in a lot of countries, increasing amounts of young people are really questioning the role of higher education and saying it's very expensive, or it's time consuming, or it's not the best option, and they want to skip over it and go straight into work. So I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we really need to start thinking about alternatives to higher education and looking towards companies perhaps providing alternatives and working with young people so that there's much more of a collaboration, because hiring young people makes sense. Brands and companies that don't just hire people, young people, but work with them to make decisions and put them in management roles do much better. It makes economic sense. So I think the really key things are sharing, collaboration and communication across generations. And I think that's one of the key sort of solutions we have available to us in the next 10 years. And of course, there has to be kind of wider solutions. And having spent the last 10 years talking to young people and being very aware of some of the really big hurdles we face, I decided to create a thing called the 16 Project. And very quickly, and sort of you can get much more information at a later date if you need, the 16 Project is an innovative project that's going to bring together the young visionary campaigners of tomorrow who have groundbreaking ideas about how to make the world a better place and solutions to make that happen. The 16 Project will introduce tomorrow's solutions with today's challenges, bringing together the brightest young campaigners and change makers with government and industry to overcome the real problems we face today. And we're starting the 16 Project with climate and the environment, so please do join us. And if you'd like more information about any of the things I've talked about, whether it's young people, because obviously this has been a very brief presentation, or you'd like to know about the 16 Project, or a young person, or you're a company who's interested in young people or collaborating young people, please do get in touch with me at chloecombi.net or LinkedIn. And thank you very much for listening today. And I hope everyone's keeping well in these very strange times. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Chloe, for that vibrant insight into the minds of younger people. Whatever your age, keep providing your questions to Chloe in the comments section. Tune in on Thursday to hear from Peter Fox-Penner, expert on the future of energy systems and partner at US cleantech fund Energy Impact Partners. Until then, take care and thank you for watching.